Entwined is a podcast about how so much of the world around us is wound or twisted together. This podcast strives to lay bare unexposed or indiscernible connections using historical and anecdotal sources. I am Elliot Gladstone, and alongside P.S. McKay, this is Entwined. Hi, I'm Elliot Gladstone, and I personally want to thank you for listening to our show. A few months back, McKay and I had the crazy idea to start a podcast to share our creativity with the world. We kicked around ideas and ultimately didn't have any expectations of what would happen. We posted our first few shows and were absolutely shocked with the response. I honestly thought my mom, my aunt, and maybe a few other people directly related to me by blood, marriage, or otherwise would be the only ones to give our little show a chance. But boy, was I wrong. Immediately, hundreds of you subscribed, and after just 1 month, we have over 600 subscribers. Now we are almost 2 months into the podcast and keep striking a chord with new listeners as our numbers continue to grow. We love being able to do this show and have just one request of you. To help others find the show, we need your help. Please take a few minutes to review and rate the show in iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts. It sounds silly, but without reviews, we can't land where others can find us. If you want to check out more about the show, the authors, or our bi-weekly finger food articles, please check out entwinedpodcast.com. Thank you again for your support. And now, on with the show. Perspective is a hell of a thing. Two people standing on the same street, watching the same scenario unfold at exactly the same time, can fail to recall events in the same way. That's perspective. We each end up molded and seasoned by our experiences and are able to pull out the elements we deem critical to a particular moment, whether it be an argument we are attempting to win, or how dramatically a work of art impacts how we feel about the design of a room. There it is again, perspective, our point of view. To add a degree of difficulty to an already complicated routine, perspective changes over time. Think of perspective more as a living document or a book you are writing, where every night you can choose to add or subtract from the narrative, your narrative. Think about a happy time or a wonderful moment. Here, try this. For those of you with children, remember back to the moment that you held your son or daughter for the very first time. You were probably in a hospital, maybe it was in your home, and you can picture how that felt. How tiny she was in your arms. Think of the noises that she made, how she smelled. Think about that moment when you looked at her for the very first time and you knew immediately you would never look at the world the same way again. You sat there holding her, staring at her tiny fingers, trying to coax your larger fingers into the palm of her hand, hoping she would hold on to you tightly and never let you go. You knew, no question, and within 30 seconds had already shifted your mindset to protector, guardian, father, or mother, and would do anything for that baby girl to keep her safe. In high school, I had an opportunity to spend a few hours with a man by the name of Santiago, and to be honest, I was unimpressed. Santiago was an older man who had a string of bad luck and was no longer capable of delivering his best work. Santiago lived in a small town where most of the people knew each other. To hear Santiago, to hear him talk about how people felt about him was depressing, because he was clearly looked at as a failure by the people who knew him. Santiago was self-employed and spent much of his life just trying to make ends meet. As a high school student in an affluent area, I almost looked down on the man. I had respect for what he had accomplished in his life, for the most part at least. But he was poor, he was uninteresting, and he seemed to be nearing the end of his usefulness as a member of society. In class, Santiago explained to us that despite how the people of his town felt about him, he would never give up, and he would take every opportunity to prove them wrong. He chose not to allow himself to consider his age or his waning physical strength to be an excuse. Santiago explained that despite continued failure, he was still a proud man and capable of greatness. As a high school student interested in several different sports, getting to love and know music, and trying to figure out girls, it was hard for me to respect and understand Santiago for what he truly was. My perspective at the time would not allow me to understand his plight, or even to see how significant it was when he found success. Santiago, after almost 3 months of failures, told me of his greatest achievement and how over several days he was able to shed the label of has-been and brings home some success and eventually garner the respect of the other men from his community. At the time, it didn't even faze me, and I immediately moved on to thinking about girls again, or how loud I was going to listen to Bon Jovi's New Jersey when I got home. Hearing his story at 15 or 16 wasn't significant or impactful, and although he was clearly able to show his town he wasn't finished, I still wasn't in a position to be impressed. Funny how perspective is always there, banging the bass drum and hitting the hi-hat, trying to keep us in rhythm, making sure we pass judgment on a moment in an attempt to catalog it for the future. As an adult, looking back on that moment, I'm able to see what the high school me wasn't able to grasp. My perspective as an adult is different, if for no other reason than, well, because I'm an adult. Sounds terribly strange to say, but the truth is that it is pretty much right on the money. The adult me loves the idea of the older guy who seems to be a little washed up, getting his crap together and delivering one more masterpiece. Kids have their whole lives in front of them, but adults, well, our days feel more numbered, and Santiago is just one such man who has a story of rebound, redemption, and one last shot at greatness. It's interesting. As you look through the history books, you'll notice they're filled with individuals who achieved greatness. Some of them in spite of an abusive parent, some of them in spite of their humble upbringing, and still some, with silver spoon in mouth, making it to the top of the food chain, almost as if it was preordained. However, there are stories, ones like Santiago's, where historical figures met the challenge of hard times only to overcome personal adversity and achieve success. Napoleon Bonaparte is one of the most celebrated military minds of any generation. He was born in the late 1700s in France and eventually attended the military college of Brienne, and then on to the academy in Paris. Later, he ended up in the good graces of Robespierre and had been credited with saving the Directory from the counter-revolutionary forces. Amazingly enough, that experience led him to being given control of France's 30,000-man army, where he found success relatively quickly. Napoleon grew his army to over 600,000 men over a period of 20 years. In 1810, he would lose the first of many battles which impacted his standing within the government. The human toll of losing a war during this time period was debilitating. Not only was Napoleon experiencing significant loss of able fighters, but the financial burden it put on the government sparked the beginning of the end for the military leader. In 1814, Napoleon was exiled to the Mediterranean island of Elba. Many thought Napoleon was done, thought that he was finished. It was expected that he would live out his years spending the time there fishing, sailing, and drinking fine wine. Elba is a beautiful place, and being exiled there with the financial means to purchase homes and entertain would not be the worst thing. However, Napoleon was not done. He was not finished, and after 10 months in exile, he escaped the island with 1,000 supporters and returned to France to reclaim his throne as emperor. Napoleon shared a similar experience to Santiago, where both men struggled to impact the views of their peers and their community. Santiago wasn't running into battle to protect a nation, but he was working against the same judgment and viewpoints that ailed Napoleon. War provides a lot of opportunity, and the American Civil War was no different. In 1843, Ulysses S. Grant was a graduate of the prestigious West Point Academy and started his military career in 1844. Fun fact, Grant was born with the given name of Hiram Ulysses Grant, and eventually officially changed his names to Ulysses S. Grant because of an administrative mistake while attending at West Point. Grant was quickly shipped off to the Mexican-American War, where he would then meet with a series of promotions, eventually landing him as captain. It was during this time period that Ulysses S. Grant became really close friends with whiskey. It is widely known that Grant had a lifelong relationship with the bottle, and the times of war really helped nudge him over the edge. Grant began to drink while on duty, off duty, near duty, and around duties. He started to draw attention to himself and eventually was forced to resign from the military. Grant married and decided after his resignation to move to Missouri to run a farm and start his family. Grant spent 5 years struggling to survive and working his farm, which was not productive. The land was a gift from his father-in-law, and despite having a reasonable home and several crop varieties, he failed to make ends meet. Grant had a northern view of things and didn't use slaves to work the fields. It was likely this fact which made his enterprise insolvent, as he struggled to compete with some of the other farms in the area. In 1857, he tucked his tail between his legs and accepted a position in his father's leather shop, where he was finally able to locate sobriety. He was a busy man working for his father and tending to his family, and ended up not having time to drink as he did in the past. In 1861, he wanted to try and get back into the military, but his reputation as a drunk and a failure was getting in the way. He ended up processing paperwork in a volunteer office, where he garnered the attention of a few very important people. It was previously the point of view of the U.S. military that Grant was useless and found it hard to believe that he would be able to organize anything. Despite his storied past, Major General Fremont pushed to get Grant assigned to a unit of command. Grant was determined, much like Santiago, to prove everyone was wrong, and in short order was able to get a unit assigned to him ready for battle. Off the sauce, he was able to demonstrate his ability to organize his troops, plan for battles, and lead large armies of men. In 1864, President Abraham Lincoln bestowed the rank of Lieutenant General upon Grant, which was an honor that only President George Washington had previously received. Grant focused his attention on trying to keep Robert Lee's army busy by destroying the South's willingness to fight, and just 1 year later, in 1865, he accepted Lee's surrender. As anyone who attended grammar school knows, Ulysses S. Grant ended up being the 18th President of the United States. He battled back from potential personal collapse and proved to himself, his family, and the military that he wasn't done yet, having greatness still within him. Greatness is a concept which many claim to reserve judgment on before acknowledging. This idea extends well beyond the battlefield into society and culture. Ernest Hemingway is also such a figure. He was born in 1899 in the state of Illinois. Most remember him as an author, but he was also a soldier in World War I and a war correspondent in World War II. He also spent time working for a newspaper where he wrote mostly about sports. Hemingway was an interesting man who loved Cuba, sailing, and fishing. Hemingway's work was largely autobiographical, and most of what he wrote about could be seen in the experience he had over the years. From 1920 through 1941, he was responsible for several amazing literary works which included Farewell to Arms and For Whom the Bell Tolls. Hemingway was not without personal struggle and found himself married several times, and after World War II, many people has thought he was washed up. Hemingway struggled with that label and found himself depressed. He tried and failed to win the acclaim of critics, and many thought he would keep trying until he faded away. Hemingway knew he wasn't done, and just like Grant and Napoleon, he battled back to show the world, to show himself he was still capable of greatness. In 1951, Ernest Hemingway released The Old Man and the Sea, which was immediately met with critical acclaim, and many recount as the single most impressive work over his entire life. The Old Man and the Sea was the story of a fisherman who failed to catch a fish for 84 days in a row. The people of his town frowned on this and had begun to impact his relationships with the people he was close to. The old man set sail after 84 days and finally hooked a monster fish, a marlin. He spent 3 days being dragged around by the fish, and the story goes into detail about those moments. The old man does not share the same name as Hemingway, but you can clearly see parallels between the two men, especially after the book turned out to be such a success. In 1953, Hemingway won the Pulitzer Prize for the story, which was immediately followed in 1954 by the Nobel Prize. Hemingway proved he was not washed up and showed the world he still possessed the ability to be spectacular. In high school, I was asked to read The Old Man and the Sea in an English class, and honestly, it didn't resonate with me. I cataloged it with most of the other works which we were assigned and focused my attention elsewhere. Recently, I reread this same story because I was driven by the idea that an older man, after much of his life had passed, was still capable of amazing things. The Old Man and the Sea is a beautifully written story about an amazing man named Santiago and how he battled perspective, but more importantly, how he proved his self-worth. My perspective over the years has changed, and for me, a husband and father of 4 wonderful kids, I look to Santiago, and I hope to see myself someday. Thank you for listening. This has been Entwined. Entwined is a podcast that releases every other week and is written, recorded, edited, and produced by Elliot Gladstone and P.S. McKay. This episode was written by Elliot Gladstone. Please tune in next time to see what P.S. McKay has in store for us. For more information about the show or the authors, please check out entwinedpodcast.com or visit our Twitter page at Entwined Podcast.